Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Deputy Jake Morrison, and I've been carrying this weight for 4 years now. 4 years of sleepless nights, checking locks twice before bed, and jumping at shadows that shouldn't be there. I've never told anyone what really happened out there in Archer County, not even my wife Linda before she left me. Maybe especially not Linda. Some things are too heavy to share, too twisted to make sense of, even to yourself. It started in September of 2019. I was working the night shift, same as I had for the better part of 15 years. The late patrol suited me fine. Fewer people to deal with, less paperwork. Just me and the endless stretch of Texas highway under a sky so big it makes you feel like nothing at all. That night I was covering the northern section of County Road 2847, the stretch that runs past the old Pemberton Ranch and out toward Megargel. Most folks don't even know that road exists unless they've got business with the oil wells or they're looking for a place to dump something they don't want found. The call came in around 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch, calculating how many hours I had left before I could head home to my empty house. Linda had been staying at her sister's for 3 weeks by then. Said she needed space to think. 23 years of marriage. And she needed space to think. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my nights patrolling empty roads, driving through spaces so vast they could swallow a man whole, and my wife needed more space away from me. Unit 14, we've got a report of suspicious activity near the old Pemberton place. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. Sarah had been dispatching for our department for about 8 years, and she had that tone. The one that said she wasn't sure what she was dealing with, but it wasn't sitting right with her. Copy that, dispatch. What kind of activity we talking about? Caller reported seeing lights moving around the property. Says they've been watching for about an hour, and there's no vehicle visible, but the lights keep moving from building to building. I pulled my cruiser over to the shoulder and grabbed my notepad. The Pemberton Ranch had been empty for 5 years, ever since old Joe Pemberton had his stroke and moved to Dallas to live with his daughter. The property sat on about 200 acres of scrubland, dotted with mesquite trees and a few oil pumps that still worked. The main house was a 2-story farmhouse that had seen better days, and there were several outbuildings scattered around the property. A barn, a couple of storage sheds, and an old bunkhouse that the ranch hands used to use back when the place was operational. Any description of the lights? Caller said they looked like flashlights or maybe lanterns, moving slow, like someone was searching for something. I made a note and put the car back in drive. 10-4 en route. ETA about 15 minutes. Copy that, Unit 14. Be advised, we tried calling the property owner but no answer. Daughter in Dallas says nobody should be out there. That was information I already knew. Joe Pemberton's daughter, Mary, had been trying to sell the place for years but couldn't find a buyer. The house needed too much work and the land wasn't good for much except grazing, and even then, you'd need more acreage to make it worthwhile. Every few months, I'd drive by just to check on things, make sure kids weren't using it for parties or meth heads weren't setting up shop. It had been quiet for months. The drive out to the Pemberton place took me through some of the loneliest country in Texas. County Road 2847 was a 2-lane blacktop that hadn't been repaved in at least a decade. The pavement was cracked and faded, with weeds growing up through the breaks. On either side of the road, the land stretched out flat and empty, broken up by the occasional oil pump nodding up and down like a giant mechanical bird pecking at the ground. During the day, you could see for miles in any direction. At night, your headlights carved out a small tunnel of light in an ocean of darkness. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, and I knew every turn, every dip in the road, every landmark. About 3 miles from the Pemberton place, there was an old windmill that had lost most of its blades, standing like a skeleton against the sky. 2 miles past that, there was a cattle guard that would rattle your teeth if you hit it too fast. And then, just before you reached the ranch, there was a sharp curve to the left where the road followed an old creek bed that had been dry for as long as anyone could remember. As I made that last turn, I could see the Pemberton house in the distance. It sat about a quarter mile off the road, connected by a dirt driveway that was more potholes than road. The house was dark, same as always, but I could see what the caller had been talking about. There was definitely a light moving around the property, and it did look like a flashlight or maybe a lantern. It was coming from the area behind the house, near the old barn. I pulled up to the gate at the end of the driveway and killed my engine. The gate was chained shut, same as always, but the chain was hanging loose. That was new. I got out of my cruiser and walked over to take a look. The chain had been cut with bolt cutters, clean cut through one of the links. The cut looked fresh, no rust on the exposed metal. I radioed in my position and the condition of the gate, then opened it and drove through. The dirt driveway was rutted and overgrown with weeds, and my cruiser bounced and lurched as I made my way toward the house. I kept my headlights on but drove slowly, not wanting to announce my presence too obviously. As I got closer, I could see the light more clearly. It was definitely a flashlight, and it was moving in a systematic pattern back and forth across the area behind the barn. I parked about 50 yards from the house, positioning my cruiser so I could make a quick exit if needed. Before getting out, I checked my weapon and my radio, then grabbed my own flashlight from the charger. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds of the Texas countryside: crickets, the distant hum of an oil pump, and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. As I approached the house, I could hear something else. It sounded like someone was digging, the scrape of a shovel against hard earth. The sound was coming from behind the barn, where I'd seen the light. I moved carefully, keeping to the shadows, trying to get a better look at what was going on. The barn was about 100 yards behind the house, a weathered wooden structure that had seen better days. Half the roof was gone, and the walls were gray with age and neglect. But as I got closer, I could see that someone had been doing work on it recently. There were fresh boards nailed over some of the gaps in the walls, and the area around the barn had been cleared of weeds. I crept around to the side of the barn, where I could see the source of the light. There was a man digging in the dirt behind the barn, working by the light of a battery-powered lantern. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was digging methodically, like someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. I watched him for several minutes, trying to decide on my approach. He didn't look particularly threatening, just a guy with a shovel, but something about the whole situation didn't feel right. The fresh repairs to the barn, the systematic way he was digging, the fact that he'd cut the chain to get onto the property, it all added up to something more than just casual trespassing. I decided to announce myself and see what his story was. I moved back around to the front of the barn and called out, "Sheriff's Department, I need you to step away from the shovel and show me your hands." The man stopped digging immediately. He straightened up slowly, but he didn't drop the shovel, and he didn't turn around. He just stood there, perfectly still, like a deer that's just caught scent of a predator. I said, "Step away from the shovel and show me your hands," I repeated, moving closer with my flashlight trained on him. That's when he turned around, and I got my first good look at his face. He was older than I'd thought, maybe in his 60s, with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes. But what struck me most was his expression. He wasn't surprised or startled like most people would be when confronted by a cop. He looked almost relieved. "Evening, Deputy," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I've been expecting you." That was the first thing that really set off alarm bells in my head. Expecting me? Well, not you specifically, but I figured someone would come eventually. People around here don't mind their own business much. He was still holding the shovel, and I could see that he'd been digging for a while. There was a hole about 3 feet deep and maybe 4 feet across. The dirt was piled neatly beside it, and I could see that the soil was different colors, some dark and rich, some lighter and more sandy, like he'd been digging through layers that had been disturbed before. "I'm going to need you to put that shovel down and step back," I said, keeping my voice firm but not aggressive. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." "I know whose property this is," he said, but he did set the shovel down and take a step back. "I used to work here, back when Joe Pemberton was still running cattle. That was, must be 15 years ago now." That gave me pause. Joe Pemberton had employed several ranch hands over the years, and I didn't know all of them. It was possible this guy was telling the truth, but that didn't explain what he was doing out here in the middle of the night, digging holes. "What's your name?" I asked. "Tom Brennan. I worked for Joe from 98 to 2004, lived in the bunkhouse over there." He nodded toward a small building I could barely make out in the darkness. "And what are you doing out here tonight, Tom?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him thinking, weighing his options. Finally he said, "I buried something here a long time ago. Something I need to get back." "What kind of something?" Another pause. "Money. About $50,000 in cash." That was a lot of money, especially for a ranch hand. I started to get a bad feeling about where this was going. "Why'd you bury money out here?" "It's complicated." "I've got time." Tom Brennan looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him making a decision. "I stole it," he said finally. "From Joe, back in 2004. I was supposed to take it to the bank, cattle sale money, but I took it instead. I was going to leave town, start over somewhere else. But I got scared. Figured if I just disappeared with that much cash, people would know I took it. So I buried it here. Planned to come back for it later." "And you never came back?" "I tried. A few months later I drove by, but Joe had hired new hands and they were living in the bunkhouse. Then Joe's wife got sick, and there were always people around. Then Joe had his stroke, and the daughter was coming out here all the time dealing with lawyers and real estate people. I never had a chance to get back here alone." It was a plausible story, but something still didn't feel right. "Why now? Why tonight?" "Because I'm dying," he said simply. "Cancer. Doctor says I've got maybe 6 months. I want to make things right before I go. Give the money back to Joe's daughter." I studied his face in the beam of my flashlight. He looked tired, older than his years, and there was something in his eyes that looked like truth. But I'd been a cop long enough to know that the best lies always had a grain of truth in them. "You mind if I take a look in that hole?" I asked. "Be my guest." I walked over to the hole he'd been digging, keeping my flashlight trained on him. The hole was deeper than I'd thought, maybe 4 feet down, but as I looked closer, I could see that this wasn't the first hole that had been dug in this spot. The soil was loose and mixed up, like it had been disturbed multiple times, and at the bottom of the hole, I could see something that made my blood run cold. It was a piece of fabric, blue denim, like from a pair of jeans, and it was wrapped around something that was roughly the size and shape of a human leg. I stepped back from the hole and put my hand on my weapon. "Tom, I need you to get down on the ground. Now." He must have seen the change in my posture, because his whole demeanor shifted. The relieved, almost grateful expression was gone, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "You found it, didn't you?" he said. "Get down on the ground. Now." "I told you I buried something here, I just didn't tell you what." I drew my weapon. "Down, on the ground, hands behind your head." But instead of complying, Tom Brennan smiled. It was a cold, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. You know, Deputy, I've been watching you for a while now. You drive by here every few weeks, always at night, always alone. Very predictable." That stopped me cold. "What did you say?" "I said you're predictable. Same route, same time, same everything. Makes it easy to plan for." My mind was racing. This wasn't just about stolen money or even about whatever was buried in that hole. This was about me. Plan for what? Well, I had to make sure I'd have enough time to finish my work without being interrupted. But then I thought, why not just take care of both problems at once? I was backing away now, keeping my weapon trained on him, but trying to put some distance between us. What problems? The problem of what I buried here, and the problem of the cop who found it. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. Someone else was on the property, someone who had been waiting while Tom and I talked. I spun around, but it was too late. Something hard hit me in the back of the head, and I went down hard. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was lying on the ground next to the hole. My head was pounding, and I could feel blood trickling down the back of my neck. My weapon was gone, and my hands were zip-tied behind my back. Tom Brennan was standing over me, still holding the shovel. Next to him was another man, younger, maybe in his 30s, wearing camouflage pants and a dark jacket. He was holding my service weapon. "Welcome back, Deputy," Tom said. "We were just getting started." I struggled to sit up, my head spinning. "What do you want?" "Well, originally I just wanted to retrieve what I buried and be on my way. But now I've got a bigger problem. You've seen too much." I looked at the hole again, and I could see more of what was buried there. It wasn't just one body. There were at least 3, maybe more, all wrapped in blue denim and plastic sheeting. They'd been there for a while, long enough for the fabric to start decomposing. "Who are they?" I asked. "People who got in my way. People who asked too many questions. People who were in the wrong place at the wrong time." The younger man spoke up for the first time. "Pop, we need to get this done. Sun's gonna be up in a few hours." Pop. So they were related. Father and son working together. "You're right, Bobby. Deputy Morrison here is going to join our little collection. But first, I want to know something." Tom looked down at me with those cold eyes. "How many people know you're out here tonight?" I thought about lying, but I figured my best chance was to make them think that backup was coming. "Dispatch knows my location. They'll be checking on me soon." "No, they won't," Bobby said. "We've been monitoring your radio frequency. Nobody's checked on you in over an hour." That was true. It wasn't unusual for patrol units to go several hours without checking in, especially on quiet nights. And this had been a quiet night, until now. "Here's what's going to happen," Tom continued. "We're going to make this look like you had an accident. Fell into this hole, hit your head on something sharp. Tragic accident. Veteran deputy dies in the line of duty. Your department will give you a nice funeral, and nobody will ever know what really happened." "Except you'll know," I said. "And you'll know that eventually someone's going to find this place. Someone's going to find all these bodies. Maybe. But by then, Bobby and I will be long gone. We've got it all planned out." I was trying to buy time, hoping that somehow, some way, backup would show up. But I knew that wasn't likely. Sarah probably wouldn't think to check on me for another hour or two, and by then it would be too late. "Why?" I asked. "Why kill all these people?" Tom was quiet for a moment, and I could see him deciding how much to tell me. "The first one was an accident. Young woman, hiking alone, saw something she shouldn't have seen. The others, well, one thing led to another. It gets easier each time." "What did she see?" "She saw Bobby here burying some evidence from a job he'd done in Oklahoma. Bobby's got a talent for making people disappear, but he's not always as careful as he should be about cleaning up afterward." Bobby grinned, and I could see that several of his teeth were missing. "I'm learning, though, getting better at it." "How many?" I asked. "Counting you?" 8, maybe 9. I lose track sometimes. I was starting to understand the scope of what I'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about grave robbery or even murder. This was about a father and son team who had been killing people for years, maybe decades, and using this remote property as their dumping ground. "You picked the wrong spot," I said. "This property's going to be sold soon. New owners will want to develop it, clear the land. They'll find everything." "Maybe, but that's not our problem anymore. We're retiring after tonight." Tom nodded to Bobby, who moved around behind me. I felt the cold barrel of my own gun against the back of my head. "Any last words, Deputy?" I closed my eyes and thought about Linda, about the kids we'd never had, about the life we'd built and lost. I thought about all the people I'd helped over the years, all the good I'd tried to do. And I thought about the 8 or 9 people buried in this hole, people who had died alone and afraid, just like I was about to. "Yeah," I said. "I've got something to say." "What's that?" "I've been recording this whole conversation." There was a moment of silence, and then Tom laughed. "Nice try, Deputy. But we already checked your equipment. No recording devices." "Not on me," I said. "In my car. Dashboard cam with audio pickup, transmitting directly to the station. They've heard everything." It was a lie, but a good one. Our department had been talking about installing dashboard cameras for years, but we'd never had the budget for it. But Tom and Bobby didn't know that. I could see doubt creeping into Tom's eyes. "Bobby, go check his car." "Pop, he's lying. He's just trying to buy time." "Maybe, but check anyway." Bobby hesitated, then handed the gun back to his father and jogged toward my cruiser. Tom kept the gun pointed at me, but I could see him thinking, weighing the risks. "You're lying," he said, but he didn't sound certain. "Am I? You want to take that chance?" We sat there in silence for what felt like forever, listening to Bobby rummaging around in my car. Finally, he came back. "There's nothing, Pop. No cameras, no recording equipment. He's full of shit." Tom's expression hardened again. "I figured as much. Nice try, though." He raised the gun, and I knew my time was up. I closed my eyes and waited for the shot. But instead of a gunshot, I heard something else. The sound of vehicles approaching, multiple vehicles coming fast. Tom and Bobby heard it too, and they both froze. "What the hell?" Bobby whispered. The sounds got closer, and I could see headlights bouncing through the scrub brush. Not just one vehicle, but at least 3 or 4. And they were coming from different directions, converging on the property. "How?" Tom demanded, grabbing me by the shirt. "How did they know?" I was just as confused as he was. I hadn't called for backup, and dispatch hadn't checked on me. But somehow the cavalry was coming. The vehicles were close now, and I could see the light bars flashing. Sheriff's Department, State Police, maybe even FBI. They had the place surrounded. "Drop your weapons and put your hands up," a voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is the Texas Rangers." Tom and Bobby looked at each other, panic in their eyes. They were trapped, and they knew it. "This is impossible," Tom muttered. "Nobody knew we were here." "Drop your weapons now. This is your final warning." Bobby raised his hands slowly. "Pop, we got to give up. They got us." But Tom wasn't ready to surrender. He kept the gun pointed at me, his finger on the trigger. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me," he said. That's when the spotlights hit us, bright as daylight. I couldn't see anything beyond the glare, but I could hear boots on gravel, multiple officers moving in. "Put the gun down!" someone shouted. "Put it down now!" Tom's hand was shaking, and I could see him trying to decide whether to shoot me or give up. In the end, the decision was made for him. A sniper's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the gun flying. Bobby was on the ground immediately, face down, hands behind his head. Tom was writhing in the dirt, clutching his shoulder and cursing. and I was alive. It took me a few minutes to process what had happened. The officers who responded were a mixed group: county sheriff's deputies, state police, and 2 Texas Rangers. They cut my zip ties and checked me for injuries while others secured the scene and called for the medical examiner. But I still didn't understand how they'd known to come. I hadn't called for backup, and dispatch hadn't sent anyone. That's when Sergeant Martinez from the state police came over to talk to me. "You okay, Deputy?" "Yeah, I think so. But how did you know? How did you know to come here?" "We got a call about 1:30 a.m. Anonymous tip. Said there was an officer in trouble at the old Pemberton place. Caller said shots had been fired." "Anonymous tip? From who?" "Don't know. Voice was muffled. Couldn't tell if it was male or female. But they knew details about the situation that only someone who was there could have known." I looked around the scene, trying to figure out who could have called it in. Tom and Bobby were both in custody, and there was no one else on the property. At least, no one else that I could see. "The caller said there were bodies buried behind the barn," Martinez continued. "That's why we brought so many units. We thought we were dealing with a serial killer." Turns out, we were. Over the next few hours, the crime scene team excavated the area behind the barn and found the remains of 9 people, all victims of Tom and Bobby Brennan. The investigation would eventually link them to disappearances across 3 states, spanning nearly 20 years. But I never found out who made that anonymous call. The phone records showed it came from a burner phone purchased with cash and never used again. The call was made from somewhere near the property, but we never found the phone or identified the caller. Tom Brennan died in the hospital 2 days later, complications from his gunshot wound. Bobby was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He never talked about who might have made that call, claimed he didn't know anything about it. The official report listed it as an anonymous Good Samaritan who had witnessed the crime and called for help. But I knew that wasn't right. There was no one else on that property, no one who could have seen what was happening and called it in, unless someone had been watching us the whole time, someone who knew exactly what was going on but chose to stay hidden until the right moment to act, someone who saved my life, then disappeared into the night without a trace. I've thought about that night every day for 4 years now. I've gone over every detail, every conversation, every moment from the time I arrived at the property until the time the backup arrived. And I keep coming back to the same question. Who made that call? The answer, I think, is connected to something else that happened that night. Something I haven't told anyone about. Something that makes the whole story even stranger than it already is. Because after they took Tom and Bobby away, after the crime scene team finished their work and the medical examiner removed the bodies, I went back to my car to write my report. That's when I found something on my windshield that hadn't been there before. A note written in block letters on a piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a notebook. "You're welcome, Deputy Morrison. Be more careful next time." I kept that note. I've still got it, locked in a safe in my bedroom. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I take it out and stare at it, wondering who wrote it and why they were there that night. I never saw anyone else on the property. The investigation never turned up any evidence of a third party. But someone was there. Someone who watched the whole thing unfold and then made the call that saved my life. Someone who knew my name. The nightmares started about a week after the incident. I'd dream about standing in that hole, surrounded by bodies, with Tom Brennan pointing a gun at my head. But in the dreams, there was always someone else there. Someone standing just outside the circle of light, watching but never speaking. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and I'd get up and check all the locks on my house. Then I'd go to the window and look out at the street, half expecting to see someone standing there in the shadows. Linda came home after the story hit the news. She said she was proud of me for stopping the killers, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, knew that I was carrying more than just the normal trauma of a near-death experience. She tried to get me to talk about it, to see a counselor, or at least take some time off. But how could I explain that I was haunted not just by what had happened, but by what I couldn't explain? How could I tell her that someone had been watching me that night? Someone who knew me by name but had never revealed themselves. The marriage didn't last. Linda said I'd become distant, paranoid, that I jumped at every little sound and checked the locks obsessively. She was right, of course. But I couldn't tell her why, because I was being watched. I could feel it, even if I couldn't prove it. Someone was out there, keeping tabs on me, and I didn't know who or why. It started with little things. I'd come home from work and find my garbage cans moved slightly, or my mail rearranged in a different order. Nothing that I could really point to as evidence, but enough to make me wonder. Then there were the phone calls. Late at night, usually around 2 or 3 a.m., my phone would ring. When I answered, there would be silence on the other end. Not the silence of a wrong number or a telemarketer, but the silence of someone listening. Someone who wanted me to know they were there. I had the phone company trace the calls, but they came from different numbers each time, all untraceable. Burner phones, probably, just like the one used to call in the tip that saved my life. I started to think the two were connected, the anonymous caller who had saved me and the person who was now watching me. Maybe they were the same person. Maybe whoever had helped me that night was still keeping an eye on me for reasons I couldn't understand. But why? And who were they? I spent months trying to figure it out. I went back to the Pemberton property dozens of times, searching for any clue about who else had been there that night. I interviewed everyone I could think of who might have been in the area. Ranch hands from neighboring properties, oil field workers, even the occasional hunter or hiker. Nothing. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard the gunshots. No one had been anywhere near the property that night. It was like my mysterious savior had materialized out of thin air, made the call that saved my life, and then vanished without a trace. The frustration was eating me alive. I started making mistakes at work, missing details in my reports, showing up late for shift changes. Sheriff Roberts called me into his office and suggested I take a leave of absence, maybe get some professional help. I knew he was right. I was falling apart, consumed by questions I couldn't answer. But I also knew that taking time off wouldn't help. The questions would still be there when I came back. So I made a decision. I was going to find out who had been watching me, one way or another. I was going to set a trap. I started varying my patrol routes, changing my schedule, doing everything I could to make myself unpredictable. If someone was watching me, they'd have to work harder to keep track of my movements. Then I started leaving little markers in places where I stopped. A small stone moved to a specific position, a twig broken in a certain way, things that would be disturbed if someone came by after I left. For weeks, nothing happened. The markers stayed in place, undisturbed. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, that the stress and paranoia had gotten the better of me. But then, on a cold night in December, I found what I was looking for. I had stopped at an old church cemetery about 10 miles outside of town, a place I'd never been before. It was a small, forgotten graveyard, the kind of place where people had been buried 100 years ago and then forgotten. I'd parked there for about 20 minutes, checking my phone and writing some notes in my logbook. Before I left, I placed a small stone on top of a particular gravestone, positioned it in a very specific way so I'd know if it had been moved. When I came back the next night, the stone was gone, but in its place was something else. Another note written in the same block letters as the first one. "Stop looking for me, Deputy Morrison. You won't like what you find." My blood ran cold. Someone had been there. Someone had found my marker and left a message in response. Someone who knew I was looking for them. I picked up the note with trembling hands, careful not to disturb any potential fingerprints. This was evidence, proof that I wasn't imagining things. Someone was watching me. Someone who had been there that night at the Pemberton property. But the message was clear. They didn't want to be found. I should have backed off then. I should have taken the warning and stopped my investigation. But I couldn't. I needed to know who this person was and why they were watching me. So I kept setting traps, kept varying my routes, kept looking for signs of my mysterious watcher. And eventually, I found them. It was a Friday night in January, about 3 months after the incident at the Pemberton property. I was working the late shift, patrolling the northern section of the county. I'd just finished checking on a reported break-in that turned out to be a false alarm, and I was heading back toward town when I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a public road, and other people had a right to drive on it. But after a few miles, I noticed that the car behind me was maintaining a consistent distance, staying back just far enough to be inconspicuous, but close enough to keep me in sight. I made a few turns, testing to see if the car would follow. It did. Every turn, every change in speed, the vehicle behind me matched my movements exactly. I was being followed. My heart started racing, and I felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that came with dangerous situations. I reached for my radio, then stopped. What was I going to say? That I was being followed by an unknown vehicle? That I suspected it was connected to the Pemberton property incident? I'd sound paranoid, which I probably was. But I was also right. Instead of calling for backup, I decided to take control of the situation. I pulled over to the side of the road and waited to see what the other driver would do. The car behind me slowed down but didn't stop. As it passed under a streetlight, I could see that it was a dark sedan, maybe a Honda or Toyota with tinted windows. The license plate was obscured by mud or something else that made it impossible to read. The car drove past me and disappeared around a curve. I waited a few minutes, then pulled back onto the road and continued my patrol. But about an hour later, I saw the same car again. This time it was parked on the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead of me, engine running, headlights off. As I approached, the car pulled back onto the road and continued in the same direction I was going. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was definitely following me, and they were being smart about it, staying back, changing their approach, trying not to be too obvious. I had two choices. I could call for backup and try to pull the car over, or I could follow them and see where they led me. I chose to follow. For the next hour, we played a cat-and-mouse game across the back roads of Archer County. The other driver was good, professional even. They knew how to maintain surveillance without being detected, how to use traffic and terrain to their advantage. But I'd been a cop for over 20 years, and I knew a few tricks of my own. I pretended to head back toward town, then doubled back on a parallel road. I cut my lights and used my night vision to navigate, something I'd learned in the military years before I became a cop. And eventually, I found where they were going. The dark sedan was parked behind an abandoned gas station about 5 miles from the Pemberton property. The building had been closed for years, but someone had been using it recently. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, and I could see a faint light coming from inside the building. I parked my cruiser about 100 yards away, hidden behind a stand of mesquite trees, and approached on foot. The night was clear and cold with enough moonlight to see by once my eyes adjusted. The old gas station was a single-story concrete block building with a flat roof and boarded-up windows. But the boards on one of the side windows had been removed, and that's where the light was coming from. I moved carefully around the building, trying to get a look inside without being seen. The window was dirty and cracked, but I could make out the interior. Someone had set up a kind of command post in what used to be the service bay. There were folding tables covered with papers, photographs, and what looked like surveillance equipment. Multiple monitors showed different camera feeds, though I couldn't tell what they were looking at from my angle. And sitting at one of the tables, studying something on a laptop computer, was a woman I'd never seen before. She was maybe 40 years old, with short brown hair and wearing military-style clothing. She moved with the kind of precision that suggested law enforcement or military training. But what caught my attention was what was spread out on the table in front of her. Photographs. Dozens of them. And from what I could see, they were all of me. Pictures of me in my patrol car. Pictures of me at the grocery store. Pictures of me at home. Some looked like they'd been taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance. Others were closer, more detailed, like someone had been watching me for months. My blood turned to ice. This woman, whoever she was, had been stalking me. She was the one making the phone calls, leaving the notes, following me around the county. But why? And how was she connected to what had happened at the Pemberton property? I needed to get closer, to see more of what she had in there. But as I moved around to get a better angle, I stepped on a piece of broken glass. The sound was small, but in the silence of the night, it might as well have been a gunshot. The woman's head snapped up immediately. She looked directly at the window where I was standing, and even through the dirty glass, I could see her eyes lock onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent chills down my spine. She stood up slowly and walked to the window. When she spoke, her voice was muffled by the glass, but I could hear her clearly. "Hello, Deputy Morrison. I've been waiting for you." I drew my weapon and moved to where I could see her more clearly. "Sheriff's Department, come out with your hands visible." "I don't think so. Why don't you come in instead? We have a lot to talk about." "Come out now, or I'm calling for backup." She laughed. "Go ahead and call, but I think you'll want to hear what I have to say first. It's about that night at the Pemberton place, about who really made that anonymous call." That stopped me cold. "What do you know about that?" "Everything. I know because I was there. I know because I'm the one who saved your life." My mind was racing. This woman, this stranger who had been stalking me for months, was claiming to be the anonymous caller who had brought backup that night. But that didn't make sense. Why save my life just to stalk me afterward? "Why?" I called through the window. "Why were you there? Why did you help me?" "Because killing you wasn't part of the plan. Tom and Bobby Brennan were supposed to eliminate you, but not like that. Not yet." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not yet. She was talking about my death like it was inevitable, just a matter of timing. "What plan? What are you talking about?" "Come inside, Deputy. Let me show you." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to call for backup, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I needed answers. I needed to know what this woman knew about the Brennans, about that night, about why she'd been watching me. Against my better judgment, I holstered my weapon and walked around to the front of the building. The door was propped open with a cinder block. Inside, the old gas station had been completely transformed. The woman had set up an extensive surveillance operation with computers, cameras, and communication equipment that looked military-grade. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and what looked like operational timelines. But what dominated the space was a large whiteboard covered with information about me. My daily routines, my patrol routes, my personal information, even details about my failed marriage to Linda. It was like looking at my life from the outside, cataloged and analyzed like a case study. "Impressive, isn't it?" the woman said. She was standing behind one of the tables, her hands visible but close to what looked like a pistol lying on the surface. "I've been studying you for almost 2 years now. Who are you?" "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a federal agent. though not the kind you're familiar with. I work for a division of the government that doesn't officially exist. Federal agent? Show me your credentials. She reached slowly into her jacket and pulled out a badge and ID card. From where I was standing, it looked legitimate, but I'd never seen anything like it. The agency name was redacted, just a series of black bars where it should have been. What kind of federal agent stalks local deputies? The kind that's investigating a conspiracy that goes back 20 years and involves dozens of murders across multiple states. She gestured to the whiteboard behind her. Tom and Bobby Brennan weren't freelance killers, Deputy Morrison. They were part of a network that's been operating in this part of Texas for decades. What kind of network? Human trafficking, murder for hire, elimination of witnesses. The Brennans were just foot soldiers in a much larger operation. I stared at the information on the whiteboard, trying to process what she was telling me. And you think I'm involved somehow? Not involved. Targeted. She picked up a file folder from the table and handed it to me. Inside were photographs and documents that made my blood run cold. Pictures of other law enforcement officers, all from rural Texas counties. All of them dead. 15 officers over the past 5 years, Chen continued, all killed in what appeared to be random crimes or accidents. But when you look at the pattern, you see the truth. I flipped through the photographs. Some of the faces were familiar. I'd read about their deaths in law enforcement publications. A deputy shot during a routine traffic stop. A sheriff killed in what appeared to be a hunting accident. A state trooper who died in a single-car crash on a straight stretch of highway. What's the connection? They were all getting close to something. All of them had stumbled onto evidence of the network's activities, and all of them were eliminated before they could expose it. And you think I'm next? I know you are. That night at the Pemberton property wasn't a coincidence, Deputy. You were lured there. The folder slipped from my hands, photographs scattering across the floor. What do you mean, lured? The anonymous tip that brought you to the property. It didn't come from a concerned citizen. It came from someone in the network. They knew Tom and Bobby were there, and they knew you'd respond to the call. But why? If they wanted me dead, why not just kill me? Why involve the Brennans? Because your death had to look natural. Random. If too many cops start dying under suspicious circumstances, people notice. People ask questions. But if you'd been killed by the Brennans during what appeared to be a routine investigation, it would have looked like you just got unlucky. I thought back to that night, trying to remember the exact details of the call. Sarah, the dispatcher, had said it was an anonymous tip about suspicious activity. But who had called it in? And how did they know the Brennans would be there? The problem, Chen continued, was that Tom Brennan went off script. He was supposed to kill you quickly and quietly. Instead, he started talking, explaining things, taking his time. That gave me the opportunity to call in backup. You were watching the whole time? I've been watching you for 2 years, Deputy Morrison. I knew this was coming. I just didn't know when or where. The implications of what she was telling me were staggering. A conspiracy involving multiple murders, federal agents, and a network of killers that had been operating in my backyard for decades. And somehow, I was at the center of it. Why me? What did I do to get on their radar? Chen pulled out another file, this one thicker than the first. 3 years ago, you responded to a missing person report. A young woman named Maria Santos disappeared while hiking in the National Forest. Remember? I did remember. Maria Santos, 22 years old, college student from Austin. She'd been camping with friends and went for a solo hike. Never came back. We searched for weeks but never found any trace of her. We assumed she got lost, maybe fell into a ravine or was attacked by an animal. She was murdered by the same network that killed the Brennan's victims, and you came closer to finding her than anyone realized. Chen opened the file and showed me a map of the search area. My patrol routes and search patterns were marked in red, overlaid with what appeared to be the actual location where Maria Santos had been killed and buried. You missed her grave by about 50 yards. If you'd expanded your search pattern just a little bit more, you would have found her, and probably the evidence that would have led you to the network. But I didn't find her. No, but they didn't know that. All they knew was that a local deputy was getting uncomfortably close to one of their burial sites, so they put you on a list. A list? A list of law enforcement officers who needed to be eliminated. You've been living on borrowed time for 3 years, Deputy Morrison. I sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs, my head spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my job, my safety, had been an illusion. I'd been walking around with a target on my back for years without knowing it. Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me what was happening? Because I needed you to act naturally. If you'd known you were being targeted, you would have changed your behavior. That would have made it harder for me to track the network's activities. So you used me as bait. I protected you. Do you think it was an accident that none of their previous attempts on your life succeeded? That stopped me cold. Previous attempts? Chen pulled out yet another file. The brake failure on your patrol car 8 months ago. That wasn't mechanical failure. Someone tampered with your brake lines. I remembered that incident. I'd been driving down a steep hill when my brakes failed. I'd managed to stop the car by running it into a ditch, but I'd always assumed it was just bad luck. The food poisoning that hospitalized you last Christmas. You ate at Romano's restaurant, had the fish special. So did 12 other people that night. You were the only one who got sick. The food poisoning had been brutal. I'd spent 3 days in the hospital, and the doctors had never been able to figure out what had caused it. Someone poisoned your food. They were hoping it would look like a heart attack or stroke. Fortunately, you got medical attention quickly enough to survive. How many times? 5 separate attempts over the past 18 months. All of them made to look like accidents or natural causes. All of them thwarted because I was watching. I stared at the files spread out on the table. Evidence of a conspiracy that was bigger and more dangerous than anything I'd ever imagined. A conspiracy that had marked me for death simply because I'd done my job too well. What do they want now? Why are they still after me? Because you're the only person left who can connect them to the Maria Santos murder. And because you survived the Pemberton property incident. They're running scared, and scared people make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? They're going to try again, soon. And this time, they're not going to use intermediaries like the Brennans. They're going to come after you themselves. The thought sent a chill down my spine. When? I don't know exactly, but I know how. They're going to try to make it look like suicide. Suicide? Think about it. Veteran deputy, struggling with PTSD from the Pemberton incident, marriage falling apart, drinking problem. It would be a perfect cover story. She was right. I had been struggling since that night. My marriage to Linda had ended. I'd been having trouble sleeping, and I had been drinking more than I should. To an outside observer, it would look like I was spiraling toward self-destruction. They've been building the narrative for months, Chen continued, planting evidence of depression, making sure people notice your erratic behavior. When they finally make their move, everyone will say they saw it coming. What kind of evidence? Prescription bottles for antidepressants in your medicine cabinet? Bottles you never ordered? Internet searches for suicide methods on your home computer? Searches you never made, phone calls to crisis hotlines that you never made. I thought about my house, my personal space, and realized that it had been violated in ways I'd never imagined. These people had been in my home, planting evidence, setting up a narrative that would explain my eventual death. How long do I have? Not long. Maybe a week, maybe less. They're getting desperate. What can I do? You can help me finish this. Help me take down the entire network. She walked over to another table and picked up a thick binder. I've been building a case against these people for 5 years. I have evidence, connections, financial records, but I need one more piece to make it stick. What piece? I need to catch them in the act. I need them to try to kill you, and I need to be there to stop them and make arrests." The idea of using myself as bait again was terrifying, but I could see the logic in it. If we could catch them attempting to murder a law enforcement officer, it would give us the evidence we needed to prosecute the entire network. What would I have to do? Follow your normal routine. Act like you don't know anything. When they make their move, I'll be watching. I'll have backup ready. Like you did at the Pemberton property? Exactly like that. Except this time, we'll be ready for them. I looked around the makeshift command center, at all the evidence of the conspiracy that had been targeting me. It was overwhelming, but it also made sense of so many things that had been bothering me. The feeling of being watched, the sense that my life was spiraling out of control, the nagging suspicion that nothing was as it seemed. Why should I trust you? For all I know, you're part of the network yourself. Chen nodded, like she'd been expecting that question. Because if I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. I've had hundreds of opportunities over the past 2 years. I could have killed you a dozen different ways and made it look like an accident. She was right, but that didn't necessarily make me feel better. And because I have this. She pulled out a cell phone and played a recording. It was Tom Brennan's voice, clear as day. The problem of what I buried here, and the problem of the cop who found it. You recorded that night? Everything. I was positioned about 200 yards away with long-range surveillance equipment. I have video, audio, everything. Why didn't you intervene sooner? Why did you let it go so far? Because I needed Tom to talk. I needed him to admit that killing you was part of a larger plan. Without that confession, I had nothing. I understood the logic, but it was still hard to accept that she'd been willing to let me get so close to death just to gather evidence. What happens now? Now we wait, and we prepare. When they come for you, we'll be ready. She handed me a small device that looked like a hearing aid. This is a tracking beacon and communication device. Wear it at all times. If you're in trouble, press the button twice, and I'll know where you are. What about my department? Shouldn't I tell Sheriff Roberts what's happening? Absolutely not. We don't know how deep this conspiracy goes. For all we know, there are people in your own department who are compromised. That thought was almost worse than being targeted for murder. The idea that people I worked with, people I trusted with my life, might be involved in the conspiracy was almost too much to bear. How will I know when it's happening? You'll know. They'll create a situation that forces you to respond, just like they did with the Pemberton property. But this time, it'll be designed to look like you killed yourself. I pocketed the tracking device and looked around the command center one more time. What if something goes wrong? What if you can't get to me in time? Then you'll die, and they'll get away with it, just like they did with 15 other officers. Her bluntness was jarring, but I appreciated the honesty. This wasn't a game, and there were no guarantees. But that's not going to happen, she continued, because I've been planning for this moment for 5 years. I know how they operate, I know their methods, and I know their weaknesses. What weaknesses? They're arrogant. They think they're smarter than everyone else, that they've perfected their system. But they've gotten sloppy, overconfident. They're going to make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? They're going to underestimate you. They think you're just another small-town deputy who stumbled onto something he shouldn't have. They don't know about your military background, your training, your survival instincts. She was right about that. I'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before becoming a cop, and I'd learned things about staying alive in hostile territory that most people never had to learn. They're also going to underestimate me. They know there's a federal investigation, but they think it's just routine follow-up on the Brennan case. They don't know I've been tracking them for years. I hoped she was right, but I'd learned not to underestimate the enemy, especially when that enemy had already proven they were capable of murder. One more thing, Chen said as I prepared to leave. Don't trust anyone. Not your fellow deputies, not your dispatcher, not your neighbors. Until this is over, assume everyone is potentially compromised. The drive back to town was surreal. I kept checking my mirrors, looking for signs that I was being followed, but the roads were empty. Just me and the vast Texas night, and the knowledge that somewhere out there people were planning my death. When I got home, I looked at my house with new eyes. Knowing that strangers had been inside, planting evidence, preparing the scene for my eventual suicide, made everything feel contaminated. I wanted to tear the place apart, to find and destroy everything they'd planted, but Chen had warned me against that. Any change in my behavior might tip them off that I knew what was happening. So I went through my normal routine. I made a sandwich, watched some television, checked the locks on the doors and windows. But all the while, I was thinking about the tracking device in my pocket and wondering when they would come for me. I didn't have to wait long. The call came 3 days later, just after midnight on a Tuesday. I was working the late shift, patrolling the eastern section of the county when Sarah the dispatcher called me on the radio. Unit 14, we've got a possible suicide in progress at the old water tower on County Road 1534. Caller reports seeing someone on the platform with what appears to be a rope. The old water tower was about 15 miles from town, a relic from the 1940s that had been abandoned when the county built a new water treatment facility. It was about 100 feet tall, with a rickety ladder leading up to a maintenance platform near the top. Over the years, it had become a popular spot for teenagers to drink and for the occasional suicide attempt. Copy that, dispatch. ETA about 20 minutes. 10-4. Be advised, caller said the subject appeared to be in law enforcement uniform. That detail sent alarm bells ringing in my head. A suicide attempt by someone in a law enforcement uniform at a remote location in the middle of the night. It was exactly the kind of scenario Chen had predicted. I pressed the tracking device in my pocket twice, sending the alert signal. Wherever Chen was, she'd know that something was happening. The drive to the water tower took me through some of the most isolated country in the county. County Road 1534 was barely more than a dirt track, winding through scrubland that hadn't seen development in decades. The perfect place for something to happen to a lone deputy responding to a call. As I approached the water tower, I could see a vehicle parked at the base, a white pickup truck with no visible license plates. And there was definitely someone on the platform at the top of the tower. From this distance, I couldn't tell if they were wearing a uniform, but they appeared to be moving around, maybe setting up equipment. I parked about 50 yards away and called in my position. Dispatch, Unit 14 on scene at the water tower. I can confirm there is a subject on the platform. Proceeding to investigate. Copy that, Unit 14. Do you need backup? Negative at this time. I'll advise if the situation changes. I approached the water tower on foot, my hand resting on my weapon. The ladder was old and rusty, but it looked stable enough to climb. The person on the platform was definitely wearing what looked like a law enforcement uniform, though I couldn't see their face from the ground. Sheriff's Department, I called up. I need you to step away from the edge and come down the ladder. The figure on the platform didn't respond. They just stood there, motionless, like they were waiting for something. I started up the ladder, moving slowly and carefully. The metal rungs were cold and slick with dew, and the tower swayed slightly in the wind. As I climbed higher, I could see more details of the person on the platform. It was a man, wearing what appeared to be a deputy's uniform. But something was wrong. The way he was standing, the way he wasn't responding to my calls, it didn't seem natural. When I reached the platform, I understood why. The man wasn't alive. He was a mannequin, dressed in a spare uniform and positioned to look like he was preparing to jump. Around his neck was a noose, and scattered around the platform were what appeared to be suicide notes. I'd been set up. The realization hit me just as I heard the sound of someone cutting the ladder below me. I looked down and saw two men in dark clothing working quickly to sever the rungs, trapping me on the platform. "Deputy Morrison," one of them called up. We've been looking forward to meeting you." I was trapped 100 feet in the air with no way down, no backup, and no idea how long it would take Chen to find me. The tracking device was working, but would she be able to get here in time? "What do you want?" I shouted down. "We want you to jump, Deputy. Save us all some trouble." "Not going to happen." "That's what we figured you'd say. That's why we brought some encouragement." One of the men pulled out what looked like a small device with an antenna. The other man was setting up something at the base of the water tower. I couldn't see what it was from this angle, but it looked like it might be explosives. "Here's how this is going to work," the first man continued. "In about 10 minutes, we're going to detonate the charges we've placed around the base of this tower. The tower will fall, you'll die in the collapse, and it'll look like you climbed up there to kill yourself but changed your mind too late." "Why? What did I do to you people?" "You know too much. You've seen too much, and you're making our employers nervous." "What employers?" But they didn't answer. They just went back to their work, preparing the charges that would bring down the tower and kill me in what would appear to be a tragic accident. I checked my watch. It had been about 10 minutes since I'd activated the tracking device. Chen could be anywhere in the county, and even if she was close, it would take time to organize a response. I needed to buy more time, or find a way to save myself. The platform I was standing on was about 8 feet square, with a low railing around the edge. The mannequin was positioned near the center, surrounded by fake suicide notes that had probably been written to match my handwriting. Someone had put a lot of effort into making this look authentic. I examined the structure of the platform, looking for anything I could use. There were some maintenance cables running down the inside of the tower, but they looked old and corroded. There was also a small crane arm that had probably been used to lift equipment to the platform, but it was rusted in place. The men below were working efficiently, and I could see them connecting wires between the charges they'd placed around the base of the tower. They weren't in any hurry. They knew I wasn't going anywhere. That's when I heard the helicopters. They came in low and fast, 2 of them, with spotlights that lit up the water tower like daylight. The men below stopped what they were doing and looked up in surprise. "Federal agents!" a voice boomed through a megaphone. "Drop your weapons and step away from the explosives!" Chen had found me, and she'd brought friends. The 2 men below didn't even try to run. They raised their hands and stepped back from the charges, apparently recognizing that they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. One of the helicopters hovered near the platform while agents fast-roped down to arrest the men at the base of the tower. The other helicopter positioned itself so that I could see Chen inside, wearing tactical gear and speaking into a headset. "Deputy Morrison," her voice came through a loudspeaker on the helicopter. "Are you injured?" "I'm okay," I shouted back. "But they cut the ladder. I can't get down. We're going to lower a rescue line. Can you reach the edge of the platform?" I moved to the edge and looked down. The helicopter was hovering about 20 feet away, and I could see someone preparing to lower a line to me. It took about 10 minutes to get me down safely, but it felt like hours. When I finally had my feet on solid ground, Chen was waiting for me. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No, just shaken up. How did you find me so fast?" "I was already in position. I've been tracking communications between the network members for weeks. When they started planning this operation, I knew it was going to happen tonight." I looked at the 2 men who had tried to kill me. They were sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, hands cuffed behind their backs. I didn't recognize either of them. "Who are they?" "Contract killers. They work for the same people who hired the Brennans. But unlike Tom and Bobby, these guys are professionals." "What happens now?" "Now we use what we've learned tonight to take down the rest of the network. These 2 are going to talk, and when they do, we'll have everything we need to make arrests across 3 states. Chen was right. The 2 men, faced with federal charges for attempted murder of a law enforcement officer, decided to cooperate rather than spend the rest of their lives in prison. Over the next few weeks, Their testimony led to the arrest of 17 people involved in the network, including 2 county sheriffs and a state police captain. The investigation revealed that the network had been responsible for dozens of murders over the past 20 years, including the 15 law enforcement officers who had gotten too close to their activities. They'd used a combination of contract killers, corrupt officials, and intimidation to protect their human trafficking and murder-for-hire operations. Maria Santos, the young woman whose disappearance had originally put me on their radar, was just one of many victims. Her body was eventually found buried on private land about 10 miles from where I'd been searching. She'd been killed because she'd witnessed one of their operations while hiking in the national forest. The network's reach was staggering. They had people in law enforcement, local government, and even federal agencies. Chen's investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power in several states. But it was over now. The arrests had broken the network's command structure, and the evidence gathered during the investigation would keep the surviving members in prison for the rest of their lives. As for me, I finally understood why I'd been feeling watched for so long. I had been watched by both the network that wanted me dead and by Chen, who was trying to keep me alive. The paranoia, the sense that my life was out of control, the feeling that nothing was as it seemed, it had all been justified. The nightmares stopped after the arrests were made. I stopped checking my locks obsessively, stopped jumping at shadows, stopped feeling like there was someone lurking just outside my field of vision. But some things didn't go back to normal. My marriage to Linda was over. Too much damage had been done, too many secrets kept. My relationship with my fellow deputies was strained as they tried to understand how I'd become involved in such a massive federal investigation without anyone knowing about it. And I couldn't go back to being the same cop I'd been before. Knowing what I knew about corruption in law enforcement, about how easily people could be compromised or eliminated, made it hard to trust anyone completely. Chen offered me a job with her unit, whatever shadowy federal agency she worked for. The pay was better, and the work would be more challenging than small-town law enforcement. But I turned her down. I'd had enough of conspiracies and federal investigations. I wanted to go back to being a simple county deputy, dealing with simple problems that had simple solutions. 6 months after the arrests, I was still working the night shift in Archer County, still patrolling the same roads, checking on the same properties, dealing with the same kinds of calls. But everything was different now. I knew that there were forces operating in the shadows, people who would kill to protect their secrets. I knew that corruption could reach into any organization, any level of government. I knew that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones you needed protection from. But I also knew that there were people like Chen, working quietly to fight those forces. People who were willing to put their lives on the line to protect others, even when those others didn't know they needed protecting. The old water tower was demolished a month after the incident. The county said it was a safety hazard, too old and unstable to remain standing. But I think they just wanted to erase the reminder of what had happened there. I drive by the empty lot sometimes during my patrols. There's nothing there now but a concrete foundation and some scattered debris. But I remember what it looked like that night, with the helicopters circling and the spotlights cutting through the darkness. I remember the feeling of being trapped, helpless, waiting for death to come. And I remember the sound of those helicopters, the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, bringing salvation out of the night sky. That's when I learned that sometimes, when you think you're all alone in the darkness, there are guardian angels watching over you. Angels with badges and federal jurisdiction, and the firepower to take on the demons that hunt in the shadows. I still work the night shift. I still patrol the empty roads of Archer County. But I'm not afraid anymore. Because I know that somewhere out there, people like Chen are watching, waiting, ready to step in when evil shows its face. And sometimes, Late at night, when the radio is quiet and the highways are empty, I think about all the deputies and sheriffs and state troopers who didn't have guardian angels watching over them. The 15 officers who died because they got too close to the truth, who were eliminated before they could expose the network. They died doing their jobs, trying to protect people who didn't even know they were in danger. They died because they believed in justice, in the idea that the law should apply to everyone equally, even when that belief put them in mortal danger. I think about them, and I remember why I became a cop in the first place. Not for the excitement or the authority or the pension benefits, but because somebody has to stand between the wolves and the sheep. Somebody has to be willing to walk into the darkness and confront the monsters that live there. That somebody might die in the attempt. They might be overwhelmed by forces they can't see or understand. But if they don't try, if they don't make the effort, then the monsters win by default. So I keep working the night shift. I keep patrolling the dark roads. And I keep my eyes open for the signs that something is wrong, that someone is operating in the shadows where they think they can't be seen. Because now I know that even in the darkest places, even when you think you're completely alone, there might be someone watching. Someone keeping track of the monsters, building cases against them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when that moment comes, when justice finally catches up with the people who think they're above the law, the sound of helicopters in the night sky will be the most beautiful sound in the world. I never thought I'd be telling this story. For 8 years, I've kept it locked away, buried so deep I sometimes convince myself it never happened. But the nightmares won't let me forget. The faces won't leave me alone. And every time I drive past that stretch of highway between Lubbock and Plainview, I can still smell the smoke. My name is Sheriff Tom Dalton, and I've been wearing a badge in West Texas for 26 years. Started as a deputy in Hale County right out of college, worked my way up through the ranks. I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at a man. Domestic violence calls that ended in blood, methamphetamine labs that blew up with families inside, drunk drivers who turned children into statistics on dark highways. I thought I understood evil. I was wrong. It started in March of 2016. We'd been having problems with a series of vehicle thefts along Interstate 27, the main corridor that runs north-south through our part of Texas. Expensive trucks and SUVs were disappearing from truck stops and rest areas, usually in the early morning hours when traffic was light. The Texas Department of Public Safety had asked local law enforcement to increase patrols in the area, so I was spending more time than usual on that stretch of highway. The night everything changed started like any other. I was working the midnight shift, had been patrolling I-27 for about 3 hours without seeing anything unusual. The highway was mostly empty except for the occasional 18-wheeler hauling freight between Dallas and Amarillo. It was one of those clear March nights when you could see every star in the sky, cold enough that your breath steamed when you got out of the car. Around 2:30 a.m., I was parked at the rest area near mile marker 47, filling out paperwork and drinking coffee from a thermos my wife Sarah had packed for me. The rest area was deserted except for 2 big rigs parked in the truck section and a single car in the automobile parking area. A newer model Honda Accord with Oklahoma plates, which wasn't unusual since we got a lot of through traffic from people traveling between Oklahoma and New Mexico. I was about to pull back onto the highway when I noticed something odd about the Honda. The driver's door was standing open, and I could see the interior light was on. But there was no one around the car, no one using the restroom facilities or walking their dog in the designated pet area. The car looked abandoned. I drove over to investigate, thinking maybe someone had car trouble or was feeling sick. As I got closer, I could see that the engine was still running. The radio was playing softly, some country station out of Amarillo. But the driver was nowhere to be seen. I parked my patrol unit behind the Honda and got out to take a look. The interior of the car was clean, looked like it had been recently detailed. There was a travel coffee mug in the cup holder, still warm to the touch. A road atlas was open on the passenger seat, with a route highlighted from Oklahoma City to Albuquerque. In the back seat were 2 suitcases and what looked like a laptop bag. But what caught my attention was what was sitting on the dashboard. A cell phone, and it was recording video. I could see the red recording light, and the phone was positioned so that it was facing out through the windshield, capturing everything in front of the car, including me. I'd been being recorded from the moment I'd approached the vehicle. My first thought was that maybe the driver was making some kind of travel video, documenting their trip across the country. People did that sometimes, especially younger folks who posted everything on social media. But where was the driver? I walked around the car, looking for any signs of where the person might have gone. The rest area wasn't very big, just a parking lot, some picnic tables, a small building with restrooms and vending machines, and a short walking trail that led about 100 yards into the scrub brush before looping back. Someone couldn't just disappear. That's when I heard the scream. It came from the direction of the walking trail, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the night air like a blade. It was the sound of someone in mortal terror, the kind of scream that makes your blood turn to ice and every instinct in your body tell you to run toward the danger. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio and headed for the trail. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Dalton at the I-27 rest area, mile marker 47. I've got a possible emergency situation, requesting backup. Copy that, Sheriff. Backup is en route, ETA about 15 minutes. 15 minutes felt like a lifetime when someone was screaming for help. I followed the trail into the brush, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The screaming had stopped, which somehow made everything worse. At least, when someone's screaming, you know they're still alive. The trail was well maintained, with small reflective markers every few yards to keep hikers from getting lost. But as I followed it deeper into the brush, I could see that someone had left the main path. There were broken branches and disturbed earth leading off to the right, toward a small grove of mesquite trees. I followed the disturbance, moving as quietly as I could. If someone was hurt, I needed to help them. If someone was being attacked, I needed to stop it. But I also needed to be careful not to walk into an ambush. About 50 yards off the main trail, I found them. There were 3 people in a small clearing among the mesquite trees, 2 men and a woman. The woman was on her knees in the center of the clearing, her hands zip-tied behind her back. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with short brown hair and wearing jeans and a red sweater. She was alive, but barely conscious, her head lolling forward like she'd been drugged. The 2 men were standing over her, and they were arguing in hushed voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their body language suggested they were disagreeing about something. One of them was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing camouflage pants and a dark jacket. The other was younger, probably in his 30s, dressed in regular clothes but wearing latex gloves. And at their feet, arranged in a neat circle around the woman, were 5 white crosses. The kind you might see at a roadside memorial, but smaller. Each cross had a name written on it in black marker, and some had what looked like photographs attached. I was looking at a crime in progress, but I wasn't sure exactly what kind of crime. The scene was too organized, too ritualistic to be a simple assault or robbery. This was something else, something planned and deliberate. I drew my weapon and called out, "Sheriff's Department, let me see your hands." Both men spun around, clearly surprised to see me. The older man immediately raised his hands, but the younger one reached for something in his jacket. I shifted my aim to him. "Don't do it! Hands where I can see them!" The younger man hesitated, his hand halfway to whatever he was reaching for. For a long moment, we just stared at each other in the beam of my flashlight. Then the older man spoke. "Evening, Sheriff. Beautiful night, isn't it?" His voice was calm, conversational, like we were neighbors meeting at a barbecue instead of strangers confronting each other over an apparent kidnapping. That calmness was more unnerving than if he'd been shouting or threatening. "Step away from the woman and keep your hands visible," I ordered. "Oh, she's fine. Just resting. We're old friends." I said step away from her. The two men exchanged a look, and I could see them communicating without words. They'd done this before, whatever this was. They had a system, a plan for dealing with interruptions. "Sheriff, I think there's been a misunderstanding," the older man continued. "We're just having a little ceremony here, a memorial service for some friends who passed away." He gestured to the white crosses at their feet. "This is a special place for us, a place where we come to remember the people we've lost." "What people?" "Well, that's a long story. Why don't you put that gun down and we can talk about it like civilized folks?" I kept my weapon trained on them. The woman on the ground doesn't look like she's here voluntarily. "Sarah?" "Oh, she's here by choice. Aren't you, Sarah?" He nudged the woman with his foot, and she moaned softly but didn't respond. Whatever they'd given her, it was keeping her barely conscious. "She doesn't look like she's in any condition to make choices." "She made her choice a long time ago, Sheriff. When she decided to leave." "Leave what?" "Leave us. Leave the family. Sarah used to be part of our little group, but she got scared and ran away. We've been looking for her for almost 2 years." The younger man spoke up for the first time. "She broke the rules, Sheriff. In our family, once you're in for life. No one gets to leave." I was starting to get a clearer picture of what I was dealing with. Some kind of cult or criminal organization that didn't let members leave voluntarily. The woman, Sarah, had escaped and they'd tracked her down. But what were they planning to do with her? "What are the crosses for?" The older man smiled, and it was one of the coldest expressions I'd ever seen. "Those are for the other people who tried to leave. People who thought they could just walk away from their obligations." "How many people?" "5 so far. Well, 6 if you count Sarah here. But we haven't made her cross yet." 6 people. This wasn't just kidnapping or assault. These men were talking about murder, about killing people who tried to leave their organization. "Sheriff," the younger man said, "you should know that this really isn't your business. This is a family matter, and we'd appreciate it if you'd just walk away and forget you saw anything." "Can't do that." "Sure you can. Happens all the time. Cops see things they don't understand and they decide it's better to just mind their own business. Not this cop." The two men looked at each other again, and I could see them reaching a decision. The older man sighed like he was disappointed. "That's unfortunate, Sheriff. We really hoped we could resolve this peacefully." "It can still be peaceful. You let the woman go, you come with me, and we sort this out at the station." "I'm afraid that's not going to work for us." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The younger man wasn't reaching for a weapon in his jacket. He was reaching for something else. A small device with an antenna, like a garage door opener or a remote control. "What's that in your hand?" "Insurance policy," he said. "See, Sheriff, we've been doing this for a long time. We've learned to plan for contingencies." "What kind of contingencies?" "The kind where law enforcement shows up and tries to interfere with our work." The older man explained while the younger one held up the device. "When we heard on the scanner that you were coming to investigate the rest area, we made some preparations. There's a small explosive device attached to the gas tank of that Honda out there, the one with all the evidence of Sarah's route from Oklahoma." I felt my stomach drop. Evidence? Her travel journal, her laptop, her cell phone records. Everything that shows how we tracked her down and where she was going. If that car explodes, it'll destroy all the evidence and make it look like she died in a random vehicle fire. And if I don't cooperate? If you don't cooperate, my friend here presses that button, the car explodes, and we tell anyone who asks that you were investigating a vehicle fire when you accidentally stumbled into our private memorial service. Unfortunately, you'll have to die too because you've seen too much. But if I do cooperate? If you walk away right now and forget you ever saw us, The car doesn't explode. Sarah disappears quietly, and nobody gets hurt. Except Sarah, of course. It was a classic no-win situation. If I tried to arrest them, they'd destroy the evidence and kill me. If I walked away, they'd kill Sarah and disappear. Either way, they were going to commit murder. But there was a third option they hadn't considered. How do I know you won't just blow up the car anyway? Because we're not monsters, Sheriff. We only kill people when we have to. That was when I heard the helicopters. The sound came from the south, growing louder by the second. Multiple aircraft, flying low and fast. The two men heard it too, and for the first time since I'd encountered them, they looked worried. "What the hell is that?" the younger man demanded. I smiled. That's my backup. It wasn't really my backup. My backup was still 10 minutes away, maybe more. But I'd recognized the sound of those helicopters. They were military, probably from Reese Air Force Base near Lubbock, and they were flying a pattern that suggested they were looking for something, or someone. "You called the military?" the older man asked. "Didn't have to. They've been looking for you." It was a bluff, but a good one. If these men were involved in kidnapping and murder across state lines, there was a good chance federal authorities were already tracking them. The timing of the helicopters might just be a coincidence, but they didn't know that. The younger man's hand tightened on the remote device. "You're lying." "Am I? Why don't you ask them yourself?" The helicopters were close now, close enough that we could see their searchlights cutting through the night sky. They were definitely searching for something, flying a grid pattern over the area around the rest stop. The two men were starting to panic. Whatever their plan had been, it hadn't accounted for military involvement. They were looking around the clearing like trapped animals trying to figure out their next move. That's when the older man made a mistake. He took his eyes off me for just a second, looking up at the helicopters. It was all the opening I needed. I lunged forward and tackled him, sending us both crashing to the ground. My gun went flying, but I managed to pin him down before he could reach it. The younger man was shouting, waving the remote device, but he couldn't use it without risking his partner. "Don't move!" I yelled at him. "You press that button and you'll kill your friend too!" The helicopters were directly overhead now, and suddenly the clearing was flooded with light. Searchlights from above turned night into day, and I could hear voices on megaphones, though I couldn't make out what they were saying over the rotor noise. The younger man dropped the remote and ran. He crashed through the brush toward the highway, leaving his partner behind. I could hear him stumbling and cursing as he tried to navigate the mesquite thorns in the dark. The older man was struggling underneath me, trying to throw me off. He was stronger than he looked, and I was having trouble holding him down. Just when I thought he might break free, I heard boots on the ground behind me. "Sheriff's Department, stay down!" It was Deputy Martinez, my backup, finally arriving on scene. Behind him were two more deputies and what looked like federal agents in tactical gear. "About time," I grunted, still holding onto the older man. Martinez cuffed the suspect while the federal agents secured the scene. Within minutes, they had the younger man in custody too. He hadn't gotten far in the thick brush. The woman, Sarah, was taken to the hospital in Lubbock. She was suffering from the effects of whatever drug they'd given her, but the doctors said she would recover. The explosive device attached to her car was disarmed by a bomb squad that arrived within an hour. But it was what we found in the suspect's truck that really shook me. They had been traveling with a cooler full of human fingers. 17 fingers, each one carefully preserved and labeled with a name and date. Trophies from their victims, people who had tried to leave their organization and been killed for it. The investigation that followed revealed that the two men, brothers named Earl and Jimmy Hutchins, had been running a human trafficking operation for almost a decade. They recruited vulnerable people, runaways, addicts, people with no family to report them missing, and forced them to work in various illegal enterprises. Anyone who tried to escape was hunted down and killed. Sarah Wilson had been one of their victims, forced into prostitution after aging out of the foster care system. She'd managed to escape 2 years earlier and had been living under a false identity in Oklahoma City. But they'd finally tracked her down through social media posts and credit card records. The white crosses in the clearing marked the spots where they'd buried previous victims who had tried to escape. The location was chosen because it was remote, on private land owned by one of their associates, and unlikely to be discovered. The helicopters that had saved our lives turned out to be a training exercise from Reese Air Force Base. Pure coincidence that they'd been flying over the area when everything went down. But that coincidence had convinced the Hutchins brothers that federal authorities were closing in on them, causing them to panic and make mistakes. Earl and Jimmy Hutchins were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The investigation into their trafficking network led to arrests in 4 states and the rescue of dozens of victims who were still being held captive. Sarah Wilson testified against them, and then disappeared into the Witness Protection Program. I never saw her again, but I got a card from her about a year later with no return address. Just 3 words. "Thank you, Sheriff." The nightmares started about a week after the trial ended. I'd dream about that clearing in the mesquite trees, about the white crosses and the names written in black marker. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, thinking about how close I'd come to being another name on another cross. But worse than the nightmares were the questions that kept me awake at night. How many other victims were buried in places we'd never find? How many other trafficking networks were operating in rural Texas, using the vast empty spaces to hide their crimes? I started paying closer attention to missing person reports, especially cases involving young adults with no family support. I began driving the back roads of Hale County more frequently, looking for signs of unusual activity or temporary camps that might indicate trafficking operations. Most of the time, I found nothing. But occasionally, I'd discover something that didn't seem right. A remote property with too much security for a legitimate business. A group of people working in agricultural fields who scattered when they saw a patrol car. A truck stop where young women seemed to disappear into private trucks and never come back out. Each discovery led to an investigation, and each investigation led to more questions. The trafficking network that the Hutchins brothers had been part of was just one tentacle of a much larger operation that stretched across the Southwest. I started working with federal agencies, sharing information and coordinating investigations. It was frustrating work, because for every network we shut down, 2 more seemed to spring up in its place. But we were making a difference, rescuing victims and putting predators in prison. The work took a toll on my family. My wife, Sarah, started complaining that I was becoming obsessed, that I was spending too much time chasing shadows and not enough time at home. She was right, but I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about backing off, I'd remember the look in Sarah Wilson's eyes when we found her in that clearing, drugged and helpless and waiting to die. 3 years after the Hutchins case, my marriage fell apart. Sarah said she couldn't compete with the ghosts I was chasing, couldn't live with a husband who saw human trafficking conspiracies everywhere he looked. She moved to Dallas to live with her sister, and I didn't try to stop her. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had become obsessed. But I'd seen what happened when law enforcement didn't pay attention, when we dismissed missing persons cases as runaways or drug addicts who didn't matter. People died because nobody cared enough to look for them. The case that finally broke me came in the summer of 2019. A 17-year-old girl named Maria Gonzalez disappeared from a convenience store in Plainview. She'd been walking home from her job at a fast food restaurant when she simply vanished. No witnesses, no surveillance video, no evidence of what had happened to her. Her family was frantic. Maria was a good kid, honor student, planning to start college in the fall. She wasn't the type to run away or get involved with drugs. but the local police treated it as a routine runaway case, filed the paperwork, and moved on to other priorities. I couldn't let it go. Something about the case reminded me of Sarah Wilson, a young woman who had disappeared without a trace, whose absence was barely noticed by the system that was supposed to protect her. I spent weeks following every lead, interviewing everyone who might have seen Maria that night. I drove the route between her job and her home dozens of times, looking for any clue about what might have happened to her. Eventually, I found a gas station clerk who remembered seeing Maria that night. She'd stopped to buy a soda and asked to use the restroom. While she was inside, a man in a pickup truck had pulled up and waited. When Maria came out, the man had approached her and started talking. The clerk couldn't hear what they were saying, but Maria had seemed nervous. The clerk described the man as middle-aged, wearing a cowboy hat and driving a newer model Ford pickup with Oklahoma plates. It wasn't much, but it was something. I started checking truck stops and rest areas along I-27, showing Maria's picture to anyone who would look at it. Most people shook their heads and moved on, but a waitress at a truck stop near Tulia thought she remembered seeing the girl about a week after she disappeared. "She was with this older man," the waitress told me. "Hispanic girl, really pretty, but she looked scared. The man was buying her clothes and jewelry, acting like he was her boyfriend or something, but she kept looking around like she wanted to run." "Did you see what kind of vehicle they were driving?" "Pickup truck. Ford, I think. Had Oklahoma plates." The description matched what the gas station clerk had told me. I was on the right track, but the trail was already 10 days old. Maria could be anywhere by now. I kept searching, following every lead no matter how slim. I contacted law enforcement agencies in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Colorado, sharing Maria's description and the information about the pickup truck. I posted her picture on social media, hoping someone would recognize her. Nothing. It was like Maria Gonzalez had simply vanished off the face of the earth. Then, 6 weeks after she disappeared, I got a call from a detective in Denver. They'd found a body in the mountains west of the city, a young Hispanic woman who matched Maria's description. She'd been dead for several weeks, killed by blunt force trauma to the head. The DNA results confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Maria Gonzalez was dead, murdered by the same kind of predators who had killed the Hutchins brothers' victims. Another young woman who had trusted the wrong person, gotten into the wrong truck, and paid for it with her life. I drove to Denver to bring her body home to her family. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, sitting in that funeral home with Maria's parents, trying to explain how their daughter had ended up dead in the Colorado mountains. Her father asked me the question that still haunts me. "Sheriff, how does a 17-year-old girl just disappear? How does this happen in America?" I didn't have a good answer then, and I don't have one now. How do we explain that there are monsters living among us, predators who see vulnerable people as merchandise to be bought and sold? How do we tell families that their children matter so little to the system that their disappearances are barely investigated? Maria's murder was never solved. The man in the pickup truck was never found, never identified, never brought to justice. He's probably still out there, still hunting, still finding new victims to exploit and discard. That case broke something inside me. I realized that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many trafficking networks we shut down, there would always be more. The problem was too big, too pervasive, too deeply rooted in our society's indifference to the most vulnerable among us. I retired from law enforcement 6 months later. I couldn't do the job anymore. Couldn't pretend that I was making a real difference when young women like Maria Gonzalez were still disappearing every day. I moved to a small ranch outside of Amarillo, where I raise cattle and try not to think about the cases I couldn't solve. But the ghosts follow me everywhere. On quiet nights, when the wind is blowing across the plains, I can still hear Sarah Wilson's scream echoing through the mesquite trees. I can still see Maria Gonzalez's school picture, smiling and hopeful, unaware that her future was already being stolen from her. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed on the job, kept fighting the good fight even when it seemed hopeless. But I know that I gave everything I had to give. I saw too much, learned too much about the darkness that exists in our world. The trafficking networks are still out there. The predators are still hunting. And somewhere tonight, another Sarah Wilson is being held against her will. Another Maria Gonzalez is getting into the wrong truck. I can't save them all. Hell, I couldn't save any of them. But I can tell their stories, make sure they're not forgotten, make sure people understand that these crimes are happening right here in our own backyard. Because the most disturbing truth I learned in 26 years of law enforcement is this: the monsters don't live in distant places or foreign countries. They live right next door, drive the same highways we do, shop at the same stores. They're hiding in plain sight, and they're counting on our indifference to keep them safe. That's why I'm telling this story now. Not because I have answers, but because these victims deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be more than just names on missing person reports or statistics in federal databases. They were real people with real dreams, and they died because we failed to protect them. Maria Gonzalez wanted to be a teacher. Sarah Wilson wrote poetry in her spare time. The 17 people whose fingers we found in that cooler all had families who loved them, futures that were stolen from them. Remember their names, remember their faces, and remember that somewhere out there, in the vast darkness of the Texas night, the monsters are still hunting, and we're still failing to stop them. Listen, I need to tell you something. Been carrying this around for 4 years now, and it's eating at me from the inside. My name's Dale Harrison. I'm a deputy sheriff in Wilbarger County, up in northwest Texas. Been working these roads for 23 years, and I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. Drunks, domestic disputes, cattle rustlers, meth labs, and abandoned trailers. Hell, I even pulled 3 bodies out of the Red River after that flash flood in '98. But what happened to me in November of 2019? That's something different entirely. See, I was going through a rough patch back then. Lisa and I had just finalized our divorce after 18 years of marriage. My daughter Emma was off at college in San Antonio, and suddenly I'm rattling around in a house that feels too big and too quiet. Started volunteering for the night shifts because sitting alone in that living room was worse than dealing with whatever calls came in after midnight. At least out on patrol, I had a purpose. Wilbarger County covers about 978 square miles, and most of it's empty. We're talking ranch land, abandoned oil wells, farmhouses that haven't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Carter administration. Highway 287 cuts through the middle of it all, but at night, you might go 2 hours without seeing another set of headlights. My patrol sector was the northern part of the county, up toward the Oklahoma border. Desolate doesn't begin to cover it. The night it all started, I was maybe 3 months into working graveyard shifts, regular. November 15th, 2019. I remember because it was exactly 1 week before Emma's birthday, and I was dreading that phone call. How do you tell your kid you're doing fine when you're drinking bourbon for breakfast and your hands shake when you try to write a simple traffic citation? Dispatch came over the radio around 11:30 p.m. Unit 17, we have a welfare check requested at 1247 County Road 45. Complainant reports suspicious activity at the Wheeler property. I knew that address. Agnes Wheeler, 78 years old, lived alone in a farmhouse about 15 miles north of Vernon. Her husband Claude had died 5 years back, heart attack while fixing fence posts. Agnes had been struggling to keep the place running ever since. I'd been out there maybe 6 times in the past 2 years. Usually it was nothing. She'd hear the wind rattling the barn door and think it was prowlers, or see car lights on the county road and convince herself they were watching her house. 10-4, Unit 17 responding, I said into the radio. Pulled a U-turn on 287 and headed north toward the Wheeler place. The drive gave me time to think, which wasn't always a good thing those days. County Road 45 is a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that runs through what used to be prime cotton country. Now it's mostly scrub grass and the occasional mesquite tree. The headlights of my patrol car carved through the darkness, picking up the reflective eyes of jackrabbits and the rusted hulks of old farm equipment left to rot in the fields. I'd been out to Agnes Wheeler's place enough times to know her patterns. She was a sweet old lady, but loneliness does things to people, makes them see threats where there aren't any, hear voices in the wind. Usually I'd spend 10 minutes walking around her property with a flashlight, check the barn and the old pump house, then sit on her porch for a while and let her make me coffee. It helped her sleep better knowing someone had checked, and it helped me kill time until the next call. But when I turned into her driveway that night, something felt different. The porch light was on like always, but I could see Agnes standing in the front window, and she was holding what looked like a shotgun. That was new. I parked about 30 feet from the house and left the engine running. Radio protocol in a situation like that is to announce yourself clearly and keep your hands visible. But I'd known Agnes for years, and I could tell she was scared. Really scared. "Mrs. Wheeler?" I called out as I got out of the car. "It's Deputy Harrison. You called in about some suspicious activity?" She opened the front door, but didn't step outside. "Dale, thank God you're here. They're still back there, behind the barn." "Who's back there, Mrs. Wheeler?" "I don't know. Maybe 3 or 4 people. They came in a car about an hour ago, turned off the lights and parked behind the barn. I can hear them talking." I took my flashlight off my belt and clicked it on. "Did you see what kind of car?" "Dark-colored. Big. Like one of those expensive sedans. They turned off the engine, but I could still hear voices." Agnes Wheeler had never lied to me before. Sure, she'd been mistaken about things. Shadows that turned out to be fence posts, sounds that were just the wind. But she'd never made up stories. If she said there were people on her property, then there were people on her property. I keyed my radio. "Dispatch Unit 17. I'm 10 to 6 at the Wheeler property. Possible trespassers requesting backup." 10-4, Unit 17. Nearest unit is about 20 minutes out." 20 minutes. In law enforcement, that's a lifetime. Anything could happen in 20 minutes. "Mrs. Wheeler, I need you to go back inside and lock the door. Keep that shotgun close, but don't use it unless someone tries to get in the house. You understand me?" She nodded and stepped back inside. I heard the deadbolt turn. The Wheeler property is about 40 acres, most of it pasture land that hasn't seen cattle in years. The barn sits about 100 yards behind the house, and there's an old pump house and a few outbuildings scattered around. Places for people to hide if they wanted to. I started walking toward the barn, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The night was cold for November, probably in the low 40s, and the wind was picking up from the north. I could hear it rattling the corrugated metal roof of the barn, making that hollow drumming sound that old farm buildings make in the wind. But underneath that sound, I could hear something else. Voices. Low, muffled conversation coming from somewhere behind the barn. I drew my service weapon and held it at low ready. 23 years in law enforcement, and I'd drawn my gun maybe a dozen times. Never fired it except at the range. But something about this situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on. As I got closer to the barn, I could make out the shape of a vehicle parked behind it. Large, dark-colored, just like Agnes had described. It was a sedan, maybe a Lincoln or a Cadillac. The license plate was too dark to read, but I could tell it wasn't a Texas plate. The metal was still warm when I touched the hood with my free hand. The voices had stopped. I stood there in the darkness, listening. The wind, the creaking of the barn, the distant hum of power lines. But no voices. It was like someone had thrown a switch. I clicked on my flashlight and called out, "This is Deputy Harrison with the Will Barger County Sheriff's Department." I need you to come out with your hands visible." Nothing. I walked around the car, checking the interior with my flashlight. Empty. No personal belongings, no trash, no indication of who might have been driving it. The doors were unlocked, but the keys weren't in the ignition. The barn door was slightly open, hanging on rusted hinges. I pushed it open with my foot and shined my light inside. Old hay bales, some rusted farm equipment, a few empty feed sacks. But no people. I spent the next 10 minutes checking every outbuilding on the property. The pump house, the old chicken coop, even the root cellar behind the house. Nothing. But that car was still there, engine still warm, and I knew what I'd heard. When backup arrived, Deputy Martinez from the Vernon station, we did a more thorough search. Used our spotlight to sweep the fields, checked the fence line, even walked down to the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property. The car was gone by then. Just gone, like it had never been there. Martinez looked at me like I was losing my mind. "You sure you saw a car, Dale?" I touched the hood. It was warm. Maybe Mrs. Wheeler was having one of her episodes. You know how she gets. I filed the report as a possible trespassing with no suspects located. Standard procedure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not just with the situation, but with me. Like I'd lost time somehow, or missed something important. Agnes Wheeler called me the next morning. "Dale, I wanted to thank you for coming out last night. Did you catch those people?" "No, ma'am. They were gone by the time I got there." "That's strange. I watched from my bedroom window. Saw you talking to them by the barn." My blood went cold. "Ma'am, I never talked to anyone. There was nobody there." "But I saw you. You were standing by their car talking to 3 or 4 people. It looked like you knew them." I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall. Started thinking about how much I'd been drinking lately, how little sleep I'd been getting. Started wondering if the stress of the divorce and the loneliness was affecting my judgment. But I knew what I'd experienced. I'd touched that car, I'd heard those voices, and now Agnes was telling me she'd seen me talking to people who weren't there. That was the first night. The beginning of something that would change everything I thought I knew about my job, my county, and myself. 3 days later, I got another call. This time, it was different. This time, it was worse. The second call came in on a Tuesday night, November 18th. I was working my regular patrol, driving the northern sector of Wilbarger County, when dispatch contacted me around 1:15 a.m. "Unit 17, we have a report of a stranded motorist on Highway 287, mile marker 47. Complainant reports a vehicle pulled over on the shoulder with hazard lights on." Mile marker 47 was about 5 miles north of the Wheeler property. Close enough to make me uncomfortable, but probably just a coincidence. People break down on that stretch of highway all the time. It's desolate, and cell phone coverage is spotty. 10-4, Unit 17 responding. I was maybe 10 minutes away from that location. As I drove north on 287, I started thinking about what Agnes Wheeler had told me, about seeing me talk to people who weren't there. I'd been over it in my head 100 times, and it still didn't make sense. Either Agnes was having some kind of hallucination, or I was losing chunks of time. Neither option was particularly comforting. The highway was empty except for the occasional semi heading south toward Wichita Falls. No moon that night, just stars scattered across the Texas sky like someone had thrown diamonds on black velvet. The kind of night that makes you feel small and alone, even when you're not. I saw the hazard lights before I reached mile marker 47. A car pulled over on the right shoulder, emergency flashers blinking in the darkness. As I got closer, I could see it was the same dark sedan from the Wheeler property. Same make, same color, same out-of-state plates that I couldn't quite read. My heart started pounding. This wasn't a coincidence. This was... I don't know what this was. I pulled up behind the sedan, and turned on my overhead lights. Standard procedure for a traffic stop, even though this wasn't exactly a stop. I called it in to dispatch. Unit 17, I'm 10 to 6 at mile marker 47, assisting stranded motorist. 10-4, Unit 17. I got out of my patrol car and approached the sedan. The driver's door was open, but I couldn't see anyone inside. I had my flashlight in my left hand and my right hand resting on my service weapon. Hello? Sheriff's Department. You folks need assistance? No response. I got closer to the car and shined my light inside. The interior was pristine. No personal belongings, no signs that anyone had been driving it. The keys were in the ignition, but the engine was off. The car was completely empty. That's when I heard the voices again. They were coming from the field on the other side of the highway. Low, muffled conversation, just like at the Wheeler property. But this time I could make out some words. Not enough to understand what they were saying, but enough to know they were speaking English. I crossed the highway and stood at the edge of the field. It was overgrown pasture land, maybe waist-high grass and scattered mesquite trees. The voices seemed to be coming from a spot about 50 yards into the field. I should have called for backup, should have waited for Martinez or one of the other deputies, but something drew me into that field, like I was being pulled by invisible strings. The grass was thick and tangled, grabbing at my boots with every step. I kept my flashlight pointed toward the ground to avoid tripping, looking up every few seconds to try to locate the source of the voices. They stopped again, just like at the Wheeler property. Complete silence except for the wind in the grass and the distant hum of power lines. I found myself standing in a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across. The grass had been trampled down, like several people had been standing there recently. But there was no one there now. I called out again. Sheriff's Department, I know you're out here. I need you to show yourselves. The silence stretched on. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, listening to my own breathing and the sound of my heart beating in my ears. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice coming from somewhere in the darkness. Unit 17, I'm 10 to 6 at mile marker 47, assisting stranded motorist. It was my voice, my words, but I wasn't speaking. I was standing in that field, mouth closed, listening to myself make a radio call that I'd already made 15 minutes earlier. I fumbled for my radio, hands shaking. Dispatch Unit 17, did you copy my last transmission? Unit 17, you're coming in broken and unclear. Can you repeat? Dispatch, I'm at mile marker 47. Did I call in a traffic stop here? Negative, Unit 17. You called in a stranded motorist about 15 minutes ago. What's your status? I stood there in that field, trying to process what was happening. According to dispatch, I'd called in the stranded motorist once, but I'd just heard myself make that same call again. Heard my own voice coming from the darkness around me. Unit 17, what's your 1020? I'm still at mile marker 47, investigating. Do you need backup, Unit 17? I wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell dispatch that I was losing my mind, that I was hearing things that weren't there, seeing things that couldn't be real. But how do you explain that to someone? How do you tell your supervisor that you're standing in a field listening to your own voice echo back at you from the darkness? Negative, dispatch, I'm 10-8. I walked back to the highway. The sedan was still there, hazard light still blinking. But when I looked inside again, there were personal belongings scattered across the seats. A coffee cup in the cup holder. A road atlas on the passenger seat. A cell phone charger plugged into the cigarette lighter. Things that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. I stood beside that car for a long time trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Trying to figure out if I was having some kind of breakdown, if the stress and the drinking and the loneliness had finally pushed me over the edge. That's when I noticed the man standing on the other side of the highway. He was maybe 40 years old, wearing a dark suit and tie. Just standing there in the middle of nowhere at 1:30 in the morning, like he was waiting for a bus. When he saw me looking at him, he walked across the highway toward me. "Evening, Deputy Harrison." He knew my name. I'd never seen him before in my life, but he knew my name. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification." He smiled and reached into his jacket. For a second, I thought he was going for a weapon, and my hand went to my gun. But he pulled out a badge, federal badge. "Agent Morrison, Department of Homeland Security. I think we need to talk." I looked at the badge, then at his face. He had the kind of eyes that had seen things, the kind of expression that comes from years of keeping secrets. "What's Homeland Security doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" "Same thing you are, Deputy. Investigating unusual activity." "You mean the car?" "I mean the pattern, the reports, the calls that don't make sense, and the evidence that disappears before backup arrives." He knew. Somehow, this federal agent knew exactly what had been happening to me. "Agent Morrison, I need to ask you something. Are you really here? Are you really standing in front of me right now?" He didn't laugh, didn't look at me like I was crazy, just nodded slowly. "I'm here, Deputy, and so are you, and so are they." "Who's they?" "The people you've been chasing, the voices you've been hearing, the car that's here 1 minute and gone the next. They're real, Deputy Harrison, and they're not going away." The sedan's hazard lights stopped blinking. The engine started up, even though no one was in the driver's seat. The car pulled away from the shoulder and disappeared into the darkness, heading north toward Oklahoma. Agent Morrison watched it go, then turned back to me. "Deputy Harrison, I need you to understand something. What you've been experiencing, it's not in your head. It's not the stress or the drinking or the divorce. It's real. And it's been happening to law enforcement officers across this region for the past 18 months. "What kind of operation are we talking about?" "The kind that doesn't officially exist. The kind that leaves no traces and no witnesses. The kind that makes good cops question their own sanity." I thought about Agnes Wheeler, about her claim that she'd seen me talking to people who weren't there, about the voices in the darkness and the car that appeared and disappeared like a ghost. "What do they want?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. But Deputy Harrison, I need you to know something else. Agnes Wheeler didn't die of a heart attack." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "She was found dead in her home 3 days ago. Coroner ruled it natural causes, but there were things at the scene that didn't add up. Signs of a struggle. Evidence that someone had been in her house. Agnes Wheeler was dead. The sweet old lady who made coffee for lonely deputies and worried about prowlers in her barn was dead. And according to Agent Morrison, it wasn't natural causes." "You think they killed her?" "I think Agnes Wheeler saw something she wasn't supposed to see, just like you did." I stood there on the side of Highway 287, listening to the wind and the distant hum of power lines, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about my job, my county, and my life had just changed forever. "Agent Morrison, what do you need me to do?" "What you've been doing, Deputy. Keep working your patrol, keep responding to calls. But from now on, you're not alone. We're watching, and when they make their next move, we'll be ready." He walked away into the darkness, leaving me standing beside my patrol car with more questions than answers. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was losing my mind. I felt like I was finally beginning to understand that sometimes the job of protecting people means facing things that aren't supposed to exist. Things that hide in the darkness between radio calls and patrol routes. Things that kill old ladies who see too much and make good cops question their own reality. As I drove back toward town, I kept checking my rearview mirror. The highway behind me was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. That somewhere in the darkness, eyes were watching every move I made. The game had changed, and I was right in the middle of it.